My hands, gnarled with 72 years of life, shook as I adjusted the collar of my morning dress. My son, Mark, stood in the doorway of what was once my husband's study, a tape measure dangling from his hand like a grotesque pendulum. His wife, Julia, was already calling out room dimensions, her voice like a bird picking at scraps. Just 2 weeks ago, this house in Scottsdale was a home. Now it was a museum of a life being dismantled. They weren't grieving. They were vultures circling the carcass of a legacy they believed was theirs alone. If you're ready for a story about dignity, revenge, and the truth that echoes louder than greed, make sure to subscribe and like this video. It helps me share this journey with more people who need to hear it. I think we can put Mom's things in the guest room for now, Julia said, not even looking at me. It's small, but she won't need much space. Mark nodded, a silent accomplice. He rubbed the bridge of his nose the way he did as a boy when he was scared, then pretended to measure the baseboards. It was a cold, calculated dismissal. They saw me as a relic, a piece of old furniture to be tucked away. But they hadn't asked about the old cedar chest in the attic, or the reason I was the only one with a key to my husband's desk. They hadn't asked because they thought they knew everything. I felt a flash of my younger self, standing in a bank office 30 years ago, pushing a folder across the polished mahogany. I was in a borrowed dress, my wedding bracelet gone, my mother's pearls pawned, but the light in my eyes was afire. I was a strategist then, not a silent wife. I secured the loan, I wrote the proposal, and I saved the company that became a multi-million-dollar empire. They assumed it was a miracle, a stroke of genius from my husband. They never considered whose hands held the pen. Their voices were a blur now, a buzzing sound in my ears, the sound of greed. I wanted to scream, to tell them they were dividing a fortune built on my sacrifice, on the lost ghosts of my family heirlooms, but a quiet, more powerful thought settled in my chest. The truth was my own, a silent weapon. It was a card I would play only when the moment was right. I let out a soft breath, the kind you take when you're readying yourself for a fight. My fingers brushed the inside pocket of my cardigan. The familiar crinkle of the manila folder was a comfort, a secret held close. They could measure all they wanted, but they couldn't measure the truth. Not yet. As Mark and Julia walked past, their laughter echoing, a new thought struck me. They weren't just dividing the house. They were dividing the inheritance. But they couldn't possibly know what was in the second sealed envelope, could they? The house had become an echo of a life that wasn't mine anymore. In Scottsdale, the sun bleaches truth faster than lies, and every room felt like a stranger's, invaded by their blueprints and discussions of renovations. I wandered into the living room, my gaze falling on the empty space where a grand piano once stood. "I'll have it moved to storage," Mark had said. It was a piano he had learned to play on, the one my husband bought for me with the first big bonus check, a check I helped him get. My mind drifted back to the day the last piece of my old life, my grandmother's silver brooch, was sold. I had held it in my palm, its intricate design a memory of her elegant hands. The money it brought was just a drop in the bucket, but it was my drop. It was the final sacrifice that sealed the deal. I didn't tell my husband. I didn't want him to feel the weight of what I had given up. I saw Julia smiling, pointing at a wall. This would be perfect for a new flat-screen TV. She had no idea that behind that wall was a small safe where I kept the few things I had left. The brooch, now gone, felt like a silent witness to all of this. It was a small, quiet, yet powerful symbol of a sacrifice they would never understand. The more they took, the more I felt my power growing. It was a quiet, internal shift. They believed my silence was empty. They didn't realize it was building, a reservoir of wisdom and strategy. I smiled faintly. They were rearranging the furniture, but they had no idea I was about to rearrange their world. The brooch was gone, yes, but I still had the receipt, and the proof of the loan, too. It all rested in that folder. They believed my sacrifice was my loss. They were wrong. It was my leverage. Maybe the brooch wasn't gone at all. Maybe John had left a way to bring it home. The scent of lemon polish and old paper clung to my husband's study. Mark had already packed up most of his books, leaving only a few on the top shelf, the ones he deemed too old-fashioned. He didn't know that my husband had a habit of leaving me notes in the margins of his favorite books. He never did this with anyone else. It was our secret language. As I dusted the old oak desk, my hand brushed against a hidden latch. My husband had shown it to me years ago. "Just for you, my love," he had whispered. He never showed it to Mark. Inside, a single handwritten letter. It was from him to me, dated a year ago. A letter for me to read if anything happened to him. My heart ached as I unfolded the paper. "My dearest Helen," it began. The room faded away. My son's voice became a distant hum. The words on the page were a private conversation with a ghost. He wrote about his pride in me, his regret for taking my sacrifices for granted, and his wish that I would be taken care of. He didn't mention money. He mentioned dignity. I had always believed he hadn't fully appreciated my role. This letter was proof I was wrong. My silent struggle had not gone unnoticed. He knew. I tucked the letter away, a new sense of purpose hardening my resolve. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about honoring his final wish and my own dignity. And there was a postscript. In a shaky hand I didn't recognize. A single line scrawled at the bottom of the page. But what was he trying to tell me? Look under the, "Has anyone ever tried to write you out of your own story? Share one line below." I read every word. My husband's lawyer, Mr. Thompson, a kind man with tired eyes, called me. "Helen, I was just trying to reach Mark." His voice was laced with an urgency I hadn't heard before. "He hasn't returned any of my calls regarding the second envelope, the one your husband insisted be delivered only to you." The phone felt heavy in my hand. I could feel a cold dread creeping into my veins. Mark and Julia were acting as if there was only one will, the main one, the one that left everything to Mark. They were already spending a fortune that hadn't even been officially transferred to them. The second envelope was the wild card. My husband must have told the lawyer to wait to see if Mark would come forward about it. "Don't worry, Mr. Thompson," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'll handle it. Could you please schedule a reading of the will for everyone? I think it's time we all got on the same page." There was a long pause on the other end. "All right, Helen, as you wish. I'll have the notices sent out." He sounded relieved. My silence had fooled them. My silence had fooled everyone. Julia, oblivious, bustled in, holding a small silver frame. "This is for the nursery, Helen. It was in one of your closets. I just had it professionally cleaned." It was a frame my husband had given me for our 50th anniversary. Inside was a photo of our son's graduation. My heart felt a pang. She was so casually taking my life apart, piece by piece, and didn't even see the value in what she held. The audacity of her actions fueled a fire inside me. They weren't just taking objects. They were taking a choice I hadn't made yet. The house had become a series of little, cruel moments. Mark had a meeting with a real estate agent about selling my husband's classic car. I watched from the window, his triumphant smile. My husband had taught me how to drive stick shift in that car. It wasn't just metal and an engine. It was a memory of his patience and my fierce independence. They were selling my past, and I felt a flicker of rage that was new to me. I decided to take a small walk around the garden. It was my favorite part of the house, where my husband and I spent most of our afternoons. As I bent to pull a weed, a small polished stone caught my eye. It was one of those small decorative stones we had bought at an artisan fair years ago. My husband had carved our initials on the bottom. I flipped it over and something else was scrawled on the smooth surface. "The truth is a seed. It grows in silence." A sudden wave of clarity hit me. This wasn't just a betrayal of a widow. This was a betrayal of my husband's legacy. He hadn't just left behind a will. He had left a quiet, intricate path of breadcrumbs for me. He wanted me to fight, in my own way. He knew my strength, even when I had forgotten it. The stone, like the unfinished letter, was a silent message. I had to stop being a ghost and become a gardener of the truth. They had started this. I would finish it. The doorbell rang. It was Mr. Miller, an old family friend who had worked with my husband for decades. He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Helen, I'm so sorry. I heard about what's happening. The rumors are everywhere. I'm afraid people think you're unwell." His words were a jab. Mark and Julia were actively spreading a story that I was mentally fragile, unfit to handle my own affairs. "I'm perfectly well, thank you," I said, my voice firm. "But thank you for your concern. It means a lot." He looked at me, a glimmer of doubt in his eyes. He had known my husband, and he had known me too. He saw a different person than the one Mark and Julia were describing. "I just wanted to drop this off," he said, handing me a small wrapped book. "I found it when I was cleaning out my father's old study. It was a gift from your husband, years ago." Inside the book was a single photograph. It was a picture of my husband and me, standing on a beach in our younger years. But tucked into the back of the frame, there was a small creased piece of paper. It wasn't a note. It was a map. My heart started to race. My husband had never been one for games, but this wasn't a game. It was a new piece of the puzzle. The map wasn't of a place, but of the company itself. Certain offices were circled in red. What could this mean? The map led me to my husband's old office at the company. I hadn't been there in years. The air was sterile and quiet. I found his secretary, a woman named Carol, who had worked for him for 40 years. She greeted me with a solemn nod. "Mrs. Anderson, I'm so sorry. Your son has been in and out of here all week, trying to get into his father's personal files. I told him he couldn't. I thanked her and asked about the red circles on the map. She looked at the map, her eyes widening. Oh my, those were the old departments, the ones your husband called the heart of the company. He said they held all the secrets." She then pulled out a manila folder from her desk. "He asked me to hold on to this for you, just in case. He said to give it to you if you ever came in alone. It's a copy of his last financial report." The report was filled with numbers, but at the very bottom, in small print, was a footnote. It was a reference to a long-forgotten, dormant account, an account I had set up decades ago with the money from the heirlooms I had sold. I had assumed the money was all used up, long gone, but the footnote indicated the account had been moved, not emptied. My mind reeled. It wasn't gone. It had been moved. If that account still breathed, so did my leverage. I was at the local library, poring over old newspaper archives. My husband and I used to come here on Sundays to sit in the quiet. It was a sanctuary for us. I was looking for articles from 30 years ago, from the time the company was on the verge of collapse. And there it was, an old article with a grainy photo. It was a picture of a young woman with a determined expression on her face, in a business suit I had borrowed. Me. The caption read, "Local woman saves her husband's business with a loan from the Bank of Helen." A small local paper had gotten the story right, but it was a small paper, and the story had been quickly forgotten. Just then, an older woman with a kind face approached me. "Excuse me, are you Helen?" she asked. It was Martha, a librarian I hadn't seen in years. I nodded. "I remember that story," she said softly. "I always wondered what happened. We all knew it was you who saved the company. He just got all the credit." I was floored. A total stranger knew the truth. Martha, it turned out, had kept all of the archives herself and knew the true history of the town. She didn't know the full story, but she knew enough. "I always thought you were a hero," she said. I was no hero, but I was beginning to feel like a fighter. The truth had been a seed, and now it was starting to sprout in places I least expected. I now had an ally, a living witness. I was invited to the company's annual board meeting, something that had never happened before. Mark, in his full arrogance, had insisted I attend. He wanted me there, a silent, fragile reminder of his absolute power. He wanted me to witness his victory. He thought I would be a quiet, dignified spectator. He had no idea I was about to be a participant. As the meeting started, the air was thick with tension. Mark presented his plans, which involved selling off some of the core, historic parts of the company. It was the parts my husband had referred to as the heart. I knew what he was doing. He was cutting the company's soul for a quick profit. I felt a pang of sorrow. My husband would have hated this. I stood up, my voice surprisingly steady. "I have a question, gentlemen," I said. "Before we discuss selling off the foundation of this company, I believe we should discuss the origins of that foundation. All eyes were on me. Mark's face was a mask of furious shock. The loan that saved this company 30 years ago. Does anyone know where it came from? A few of the older board members looked at each other, their faces betraying their surprise. I knew some of them knew the truth. The meeting descended into a tense silence. Mark's face was red with fury. He had planned for a smooth, swift transfer of power, and I was disrupting his entire plan. "Mother, what are you doing?" he hissed. "This is not the time for this." I didn't back down. "On the contrary, Mark. This is precisely the time." I reached into my bag and pulled out the old bank folder. It was worn and creased, but the documents inside were pristine. I held it up for everyone to see. "This is a copy of the original loan application, the one that saved this company from bankruptcy, the one my husband signed. But if you look at the bottom," I said, "you'll see it's my name, Helen Anderson, on the borrower line." A gasp rippled through the room. The air was charged with shock. Mark looked at me like a stranger. The board members leaned in, whispering. Julia, who had been sitting smugly in the corner, looked at me with open-mouthed terror. She had underestimated me. They had all underestimated me. I pawned my family heirlooms, my mother's pearls, and my wedding bracelet to secure this loan, I said, my voice filled with emotion. "You can't sell a part of this company without selling a part of me." The meeting recessed. The reckoning didn't. Mark and Julia were waiting for me at home, their faces a mix of rage and disbelief. "Why would you do that?" Mark yelled. "Why would you embarrass us like that? That's ancient history." I looked at him, and for the first time he seemed like a stranger to me. "It's not ancient history, Mark. It's the foundation of everything you've ever had. And you never even bothered to ask." Julia hesitated, folding a tiny baby blanket twice before speaking, as if smoothing fabric could smooth the moment. "She's lying, Mark. Your father told me that he did all of it. He told me he secretly sold some old land to get the money." She looked at me, her eyes filled with hatred. I almost laughed. She was so desperate. She was inventing her own past. It was a transparent, frantic lie. I pulled out the old photo from the newspaper and laid it on the coffee table. "This is me," I said, pointing to the image. "And this is the article from the local Gazette." I looked at Julia, then at Mark. "Your father never sold any land. He knew the truth. He just never had the chance to tell you." The weight of the moment was so heavy, I could almost feel it in the room. I had just laid out my cards, and the truth was a devastating blow. The silence in the house was a different kind of quiet. It was a charged, furious silence. Mark and Julia were in their room, and I could hear their hushed, angry whispers. I went to the guest room, the one they had designated for me. It was small, with a single bed and a small table, but for the first time in weeks, it felt like a sanctuary. It was mine. I took the framed photo of my husband and me and placed it on the table. Then I placed the small polished stone I had found in the garden next to it. It was a testament to my husband's silent wisdom. He had known somehow that this would happen. He had left me a path, and I had followed it. It had been a difficult path, but it had led me here. The phone rang. It was Mr. Thompson, the lawyer. "Helen, I've just gotten a frantic call from Mark," he said. "He wants to cancel the will reading. He says it's not necessary anymore, that the family will handle everything privately." My heart pounded. He was terrified. I knew I had him right where I wanted him. "Mr. Thompson," I said, my voice calm, "please tell him that I insist on the reading. There are some things that need to be made very clear, in front of everyone." This was it, the moment of truth. "If you were in my shoes, would you open the envelope? Tell me why." The day of the will reading arrived. The air in Mr. Thompson's office was stiff with unspoken tension. Mark and Julia sat on one side of the room, their faces pale and drawn. I sat on the other, a small, quiet presence. Mr. Thompson cleared his throat. "We are here today to read the will of John Anderson. As you know, there were two parts to the will, a primary and a secondary." Mark's knuckles were white as he gripped the arm of his chair. He had tried to stop this, but I had prevailed. He couldn't afford to make this into a public family squabble. He was trapped. "Mr. Thompson," Mark began, I believe the secondary will can be dispensed with. We can handle it privately. I shook my head slowly. No, Mark. My husband wanted it this way. Please, Mr. Thompson, proceed. I looked at him. A silent plea in my eyes. He nodded, and a small knowing smile played on his lips. He opened the second envelope. Inside was a legal letter, not a will. Mr. Thompson read, "This second envelope isn't a new will. It's my private letter confirming the testamentary trust I set up years ago. Helen is the trustee. She decides how the estate is used." He looked up. "This functions as a pour-over from the will. The trust controls the estate." The room was silent. A single tear rolled down my cheek. He knew. For the first time since the funeral, the room understood. I wasn't a witness. I was the one with the pen. Julia started to cry, her sobs dramatic and loud. "This is a joke! This can't be real! He would never do this to his son." Her words were hollow and transparent. Mark, however, was silent. He just stared at the document, his face a mask of shock. "It's all in your mother's name," Mr. Thompson said, his voice flat. "Everything is hers. But there's a condition. She has to decide now if she wants to claim it." I looked at Mark, at the boy I had raised with love and sacrifice. I saw his greed, his entitlement, his betrayal. But I also saw a glimpse of the little boy who had once looked at me with such love. He was lost now, buried under layers of selfishness and arrogance. And in that moment, I realized that I couldn't just take the money and leave. It wasn't about the money. It was about redemption. Mr. Thompson set a small velvet box on the table. Inside, my grandmother's silver brooch caught the light. "John quietly bought it back a week after you sold it," he said. "He asked me to keep it for you. I pinned it to my dress, not as jewelry, but as proof that sacrifices can return as strength." Across the table, Mark's jaw tightened. He'd come for an inheritance and found a gatekeeper. Mark finally spoke. His eyes went flat. His words cut clean. "I can't believe this," he said. "I am your son, and you're doing this to me? For a brooch? For a piece of paper?" He was lashing out like a wounded animal. I just shook my head. "It's not about the paper, Mark. It's about what that paper represents. It represents your father's trust in me, and it represents my sacrifice." He didn't care about the sacrifice. He only cared about the money. He started to yell, to make accusations. He accused me of manipulating his father, of forging documents. His words were a blur of hate and bitterness. "I can't believe you would do this to me," he said, a final cutting remark. I felt my heart shatter. He saw me as a monster, not a mother. He saw me as an obstacle, not a person. The pain of his betrayal was more profound than any lie or theft. He had always been my life's work. To see him now, so filled with greed, and so willing to throw our shared past away, was devastating. The silence that followed his outburst was worse than any noise. It was the silence of a relationship that had finally died. Mr. Thompson, seeing the emotional weight of the moment, handed me the will. "The choice is yours, Helen. It's a legal document. You can take everything, or you can give it back." My hands, still shaking, held the paper. I looked at Mark one last time. His face was a mask of desperation. He was a boy I no longer knew. I looked down at the document. It was a testament to a love I had once doubted, a final act of trust from a man who knew me better than anyone. I had to honor his wish. But what was his wish? To make me rich? Or to make me free? I took a deep breath. "I have a proposition," I said, my voice quiet but firm. I looked at Mark. "I'm going to claim this inheritance, but on one condition." Mark's eyes widened. Hope flickered in them. I knew what he was thinking. He was thinking I would just give him everything. He was so wrong. "The will," I said, my voice echoing in the quiet room, "states that I can claim the inheritance, but it also states that I can distribute it as I see fit, and I see fit to do what is just." I looked at Mark, and then at Julia. "I'll claim the estate into the trust John designed. Seed capital for women starting over. We'll sell select assets, preserve the company's heart, and I'll keep a modest stipend so I'm never anyone's burden again." They both looked at me, their faces drained of color. Julia's face contorted in a silent scream. "No, you can't," she shrieked. "It's our money, our life." I shook my head slowly. "No, Julia, it was never your life. It was mine, and my husband's, and you never even knew it. The will stipulates that I can do whatever I choose, and my choice is to honor the man I loved, not the greed of a son I no longer recognize." The air was thick with the weight of my words. I had made my decision, and it was final. The aftermath was a storm of accusations, angry phone calls, and pleas, but I stood firm. I had a clear conscience and a quiet sense of peace. The house was no longer a symbol of my loss. It was a symbol of my victory. I filed the papers to fund the trust. First grants for single mothers launching businesses. The stipend covered a small apartment and my time to mentor. Mark and Julia were a blur of fury and desperation. They threatened legal action. But Mr. Thompson had all the documents. He had the proof. They had nothing. The silence from them was a relief, a sign that they had finally run out of options. The quiet in my life was a different kind of quiet. It was a quiet of a battle won. I was no longer an observer. I was a force, and my wisdom was my greatest weapon. I chose a small rented apartment despite the stipend. It was modest, but it was mine. The silence was not the silence of neglect, but the silence of a new beginning. I was free. I had no mansion to guard, no portfolio to polish. Something far more valuable. I had given a press conference where I had announced the donation. I had explained in a calm, dignified voice the story of the brooch, the sacrifice, and the love that had guided my decision. The world had heard my story, and the world had heard my son's silence. It was a powerful, devastating silence. It was the sound of a legacy that had been lost, not by my will, but by his own greed. I had made a choice, and he had to live with the consequences. Months passed. My life was quiet, but it was full. I was volunteering, traveling, writing. I was living a life that was truly my own. I never heard from Mark, until one day, a small package arrived at my door. There was no note. Inside was a framed photo. It was a picture of my husband and me, taken at our 50th anniversary. It was the same photo I had put in the guest room, the one Julia had taken, and on the back, scrawled in a familiar hand, were 2 words. "I'm sorry." It was from Mark. It wasn't a grand gesture, a confession of guilt or an admission of his selfishness. It was a small 2-word message that said everything. It was an unspoken apology. It was a small, fragile first step towards a reconciliation that I had never thought possible. My life was no longer defined by what I had lost, but by what I had built. The charity I had created was a success. It was helping women all over the country. I was receiving letters from them every day, letters from women who had been in my position, women who had been taken for granted, women who were now building their own lives. They were filled with gratitude and a quiet resolve. I was no longer just Helen, the widow. I was Helen, the philanthropist, the strategist, the one who had given away a fortune to save a legacy, the one who had chosen dignity over money. The brooch, the photo, the stone, they were no longer just objects. They were symbols of a journey of self-discovery, of dignity, and of a power that had always been inside of me. My power, my wisdom. I am 73 now. I am sitting on a park bench, the sun warm on my skin. I am writing this letter to a person who no longer exists, a person who was once afraid to speak, afraid to fight, a person who was once just a quiet presence in her own life. I am writing a letter to Helen. I have learned that the greatest legacy you can leave is not money or possessions, but the wisdom you have acquired. I lost a son, but I gained myself. I lost a fortune, but I gained my freedom. And in the end, that was more valuable than any inheritance. My silence was not weakness. It was a strategic decision, and it echoed louder than any voice. The letter I am writing is to the person I used to be. It is a letter of gratitude. It is a letter of peace. And that, my dear reader, is the final letter to Helen. and subscribe for more stories like this.